Rahim. Bismillah Rahman Rahim, dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to talk about the Congress of Vienna 1815. Congress of Vienna Assembly in 1815 that recognized Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. It began in September 1814, 5 months after Napoleon I's first abdication, and completed its final act in June 1815, shortly before the Waterloo campaign and the final defeat of Napoleon. The settlement was the most comprehensive treaty that Europe had ever seen. And the purpose of this treaty was to establish long-lasting peace and reinstate monarchs and many other states, which the Napoleons had, disturbed. So the key people in this particular treaty were Alexander I, the Russian Tsar Empire, and then many other people were also part of this. And mainly Austria, Prussia, Russia, Great Britain, the four powers that were chiefly instrumental in the overthrow of Napoleon, had concluded a special alliance among themselves with the Treaty of Chaumont on March 9, 1814, a month before Napoleon's first abdication. The subsequent treaties of peace with France, signed in on May 30, not only by the four, but also by Sweden and Portugal, and on July 20 by Spain, stipulated that all four belligerents should send their emissaries to Congress in Vienna. Nevertheless, the four still intended to reserve the real decision-making for themselves. So the purpose of this Congress of Vienna was to establish long-lasting peace. Government leaders in Europe wanted to bring peace and stability back to the continent. The idea was rapprochement, settlement. They wanted to bury the hatchet, and they wanted to move forward, and realignment and long-lasting structural peace in Europe, because the Europe had seen many wars previously. A series of meetings held in Vienna. They were called to set up policies to achieve the goals of peace and stability. Scheduled for 4 weeks, they actually, met for 8 months. The representatives of the five great powers, and these powers were instrumental in ousting Napoleon: Russia, Prussia, Austria, Great Britain, and France. These countries sit together, and they decided to, come up with the solution, the problems with the Europeans had faced. The purpose was, what were the goals of Congress of Vienna? Number one, prevent future French aggression, restore a balance of power, restore Europe's loyal families to the thrones they had before Napoleon. So this was the main purpose of this Congress, because the Europeans, the French, when they were in power, they kicked out many royal family members from their power. Many monarchies were destroyed. And of course, the French under Napoleon were very powerful, and they carried out many attacks against these states, European states. So the idea was to prevent future French aggression. So it was basically considered as a political victory for all. In which first time European countries had cooperated to control political affairs. And first time ever, they also settled their issues, problems without any problem. They settled their issues fairly, and no country had a grudge. This peace, which was carried out in peace of Vienna, Congress of Vienna, it was lasted for 40 years. Which brought peace and stability in European countries for almost 40 years. They did not have any war. So what happened after that? The monarchs, which were the monarchies, Badshahat jise kehte hain, which were disturbed by French, which were disturbed by Napoleon actually, they were reinstated. And mainly Britain, France, they were constitutional monarchs. And the absolute monarchs are the Russian, Prussian, and Austrians. They were also restored. Okay, so I hope I told you before about the constitutional monarchs and the absolute monarchs. The constitutional monarchs are those monarchs who are governed by a constitution. एक आइन के तहत चलते हैं ये लोग काम करते हैं. And they are not absolute monarch. यानी कि जो कानून लॉ जो हैं वो कानून आइन के अंदर लिख दिया जाता है और उसके मुताबिक ये लोग काम करते हैं. Whereas the absolute monarchs, they don't care about any constitution. They are the most powerful monarchs और ये बादशाह होते हैं और इनका जो लॉ होता है ये जो कहते हैं वही लॉ बन जाता है. सो एब्सोल्यूट मोनार्कीज आज आपको देखने को मिलती हैं सऊदी अरेबिया में, फॉर एग्जांपल यूएई में है, ओमान में है, इस तरह के और जो मुल्क हैं आपको नजर आती हैं. जबकि कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन एब्सोल्यूट मोनार्क जो है ये आपको नजर आते हैं, जबकि कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन मोनार्कीज आपको यूके में आज भी नजर आती है, इसी तरह से और मुल्कों में, जापान वगैरह में भी है. So ultimately, the purpose of this Congress of Vienna was Holy Alliance. एंड होली अलायंस उनके जो क्रिश्चियनिटी के जो बिलीव्स थे उसके मुताबिक इन्होंने आपस में अलायंस किया. एंड द एग्रीमेंट बिटवीन रशिया, Austria and Prussia was actually a holy alliance, pledged to base their relations with other nations on Christian principles in order to combat the forces of revolution. So ultimately, their purpose was just to establish peace, and also they carried out holy alliance on the guidelines, on the principles, on the beliefs of the Christianity, ताकि एक दूसरे को वो bind कर सकें. Series of alliances devised by Metternich, who was a very important figure in this whole discussion, ensured that nations would help one another if war broke out. So the alliances, the idea of alliances, was also generated at that time, which later on आपने देखा NATO की शक्ल में आपको सामने आता है 1949. But this idea was very old, and this idea actually gave the base for alliances like NATO, like Warsaw Pact, like many others. So today we have seen refined version, refined picture of alliances like NATO, which is the most powerful alliance in the world right now, and they actually rule the world with their alliance. So ultimately, what was the result of this Congress? Diminished the size and power of France. It actually diminished the size and power of France because France, under Napoleon, controlled and garnered huge power, and they captured many areas in Europe. So ultimately, with this Congress, they diminished the size of the French Empire, and also their power was also reduced. So they accepted the idea that now onwards they are not going to carry out any aggression against any European countries. Power of Britain and Prussian countries, it increased. So they inherited many areas. Their monarchies were restored, and ultimately they reinstated their power. Nationalism spread in Germany, which you've seen after, in the First World War and in the Second World War, the Germans, they became, huge nuisance for the European countries because जर्मन के अंदर जो हिटलर था उसने इनके अंदर एक चीज उभार दी थी कि वी आर द सुप्रीम रेस. और ये जो नेशनलिज्म थी ये उस वक्त जब उभरी तो उसके बाद दे टुक ओवर ऑल द यूरोपियन कंट्रीज. और उसके अंदर आपने देखा कि वर्ल्ड वॉर वन, वर्ल्ड वॉर टू में क्या तबाही इन्होंने मचाई. उसके बाद इटली, ग्रीस, ये सारे मुल्क जो हैं इनके अंदर भी नेशनलिज्म काफी ज्यादा सामने आई एंड रेवोल्यूशंस टुक प्लेस. Other areas that Congress had put under foreign control. Eventually, feelings of nationalism would lead to new revolutions and new nations formed. So ultimately, the idea of nationalism in Germany and Italy seriously, promoted the idea of, statehood and nationhood. And people like Hitler and Mussolini, they actually took over the power, and later on, it was disastrous for the European countries. Most European colonies began demanding their independence. So many countries which were colonized by the major powers, they also started demanding their, independence. Ideas about the basis of power and authority had forever changed because they started, with this Congress. French just gave away their power, and many other countries they also gave away their power. So they believed in sharing the power and alliances. So the idea of, a basis of power and authority, it changed. People saw democracy as the only a way to ensure equality, justice for all, and this was the idea which later on proved very, very important for the European countries. Social attitudes and assumptions also changed after this particular congress. So basically, Congress of Vienna was a very important step in history, in which the governments in the European countries, especially Russia, Prussia, Austria, Great Britain, France, they sat together for 8 months and they started work on the idea to prevent future French aggression. They also restored the balance of power, and they restored Europe's royal families to their throne, which who were kicked out by the Napoleon. And ultimately these countries, they carried out alliances with each other, and they opened the doors for future cooperation and collaboration in future in Europe. So this was a very important topic, and I hope you understood. If you got any question, you can ask later on. Thank you very much.